Today's video is going to be a bit different to the normal videos I have on my channel. And to be honest, I was debating whether I would even make this video at all. But I talked a bit with my wife and she said that one of the things around mental health is that people don't really talk about it. And so I thought, look, I'll talk a bit about it here on the channel and maybe it will resonate with some people and maybe it might even help. I guess I'm probably on the edge or already experiencing a fair amount of burnout as a freelance game designer. And I don't think it's uncommon. It's funny, as I've researched more about what burnout is and talked to other designers in the industry, I realize how many of the aspects of burnout I am experiencing and have actually been experiencing for some time, for more than a year probably. How many other designers are experiencing that? Some designers have talked to me and said, yeah, they are well aware that they have experienced intense burnout and have really struggled to overcome that, being full-time game designers in the industry, and others who maybe don't use that language exactly, but I would say are probably close to being burnt out. And I sort of wanted to talk about it for a couple of different reasons. One is to try and, I guess, talk a little bit about what burnout is, but more importantly, with its relationship to game design and the greater tabletop industry, is maybe talk about some of the structural things in the industry which probably lead to designers being burnt out quite often, and that we might see this being a problem even more frequently going forward, and maybe some things that could change to improve that. Because at the end of the day, if we want games to be made by people who enjoy what they're doing and can keep doing that as a career, they need to be able to do it in a healthy and safe way that doesn't ruin their mental health. I should say straight up that I'm obviously not a mental health professional. The research I've done on this is ongoing. I'll put some links to some very useful videos that I found personally helpful down below in the comments, and they'll do a much better job about explaining, what burnout is than I'll do. But what I've sort of taken away from it is that at the top, burnout sort of manifests as a few different symptoms that you tend to see. One is just a general feeling of exhaustion, and exhaustion that doesn't really correlate with physical exhaustion. So it doesn't really correlate with how much sleep you've got or how much exercise you've done. You just always kind of feel a certain amount of exhaustion, kind of no matter what. The second really key part of burnout is a certain amount of cynicism or lack of empathy for other people or for the general work that you're doing, and that you generally assume that things are going to go badly, that you don't have a lot of patience or kindness with other people in the industry, or you just assume that they're not doing a good job or they're not working with you in a good way. And the third part is feeling a lack of enjoyment in the work that you're doing, that you formerly were very passionate about and very interested in doing and enjoyed doing, but that kind of enjoyment isn't there anymore. With these three symptoms, I have been feeling them for quite a while. I think when these feelings start happening, it was very easy for me to kind of put them down to other things or very specific circumstances. Sometimes something difficult will happen as a game designer. For instance, a company going out of business that you're working with that causes a lot of problems or potentially even makes you lose money. You kind of put it down to, oh, well, that was just a really bad experience. That was just one incident. And of course, I feel a bit, dispassionate and exhausted about it. But once I'm over that incident, then I'll, come back to normal. Or at different times, I'd sort of feel like, oh, of course I'm exhausted. I have so much work right at this moment. But maybe once that work kind of clears, I'll be back to my normal kind of energy levels. Or I have so much work, so I'm not feeling very inspired or enjoying it very much. But I'm sure, that will come back in time when the workload kind of evens out. I mean, even just doing this video now makes me realize that earlier this year, I talked with another game designer about this in particular, this feeling of burnout, and this designer had same experiences and much more than me, and really understood what was going on, and basically said, look, you've got to take a break. If you're not going to step back. And I sort of told him that, like, oh yeah, that's my plan. I'll do less projects and I'll do a little less work. And I realized that what I thought was stepping back and taking less work wasn't that at all. I was just doing really the same amount of work. I somehow had made some decision in my mind that was less work, but I wasn't doing that at all. And so, yeah, it didn't really get any better. The other part about burnout that I've kind of been learning about a little bit in terms of thinking about what can be done about burnout or what contributes to burnout is that there are many different spheres that can affect burnout. such as, value systems or like the workplace or the industry that you work in and how that operates. But that with these different spheres, there's always an element of personal, not necessarily responsibility, but like a personal contribution to burnout or a structural systemic contribution to burnout. And that if you're trying to get past burnout or trying to recover from that, it maybe involves looking inside you and sort of thinking about, well, what about my character or the way I work contributes to my burnout? But also looking at the things maybe outside of your own control that might be contributing to it as well. If I was to think about my main point about making the video is to probably look at those structural effects in the tabletop industry, which are going to affect all designers working in that industry, regardless of their own personal makeup. But I want to make it clear that it's not just these structural factors. They definitely have a huge impact, but there is always a personal component as well. One really good example in one of the videos I watched was about this idea of workload. And often we think about burnout as when you're being given so much work from sort of an external source that you can't control and it's overwhelming and it's just too much, and that contributes to burnout. But of course, thinking of it in a systemic way, that's one way to think of it. But it could be that often, especially freelance game designers, we often start out because we're passionate about what we want to do. We want to go the extra mile. We want to do extra work. Often you start game designing as a hobby, as a side job. It's something you do in your spare time after you work. Already you're kind of programmed to kind of push yourself personally beyond what, a normal workload might be, because you're trying to craft this career in game design and you have to kind of do that around everything else. And because the system currently kind of selects for people who do that, there's not a more measured way to become a freelance tabletop game designer. You kind of have to do it around everything else. And I've talked in other videos about the financial implications of the tabletop industry, which means basically you have to work for a very long time as a game designer before you make any money from it. So all those things go together means it selects for people who are kind of pushing themselves to do more work than maybe is what a normal workload is. And what can happen is, and I think what's happened with me, is at some point, if you're lucky enough, you get to transition into being a full-time board game designer. You're not doing it as a side job or after your normal work anymore. But that kind of drive, that feeling like you always have to do more and that you have to fit in more and there needs to be more projects and you need to start more new games, that doesn't change. You keep that outlook. And so you just keep pushing yourself. And when I meet people for the first time and they say, oh, what do you do? And I say, I'm a board game designer. And often they're really interested and they think, oh, what a cool job. And I always respond saying like, yeah, it actually is really amazing. There are such amazing benefits to being a full-time game designer. I have so much freedom in that, I don't have set work hours and I can work from anywhere. I'm making this video from Prague, actually. We're over here for 3 months visiting my wife's family. Talking with my friends and my family who, maybe have jobs where they only get a certain amount of holidays a year, but I can go anywhere whenever I want. I kind of emphasize those positives. And believe me, they are incredible positives and privileges about being a full-time game designer. But other people have reminded me that makes you forget as well that while you might not have any defined work hours, it can also go the other way, because if you don't have defined work hours, you might just work all the time. And I probably have been doing that, realistically. There's not a lot else in my life at the moment other than family and work. A lot of things have fallen by the wayside. Games, which used to be a hobby for me, are now my job. So I've kind of lost a hobby. Rob Davio made a really great comment in a video once of making the realization that once you become a full-time game designer, you have to realize you've kind of lost a hobby. That hobby turned into your job and you have to actually work at trying to replace that with something else. And I haven't kind of done that, or I haven't found something, unfortunately. Back to this idea of personal versus structural effects on burnout. And sort of for the rest of the video, I want to talk about some of these structural effects, what they are in the industry, because I think maybe folks who just play games maybe aren't aware of some of these structural things. Even some designers who are coming in the industry might not be aware of how this sort of works. And maybe some things that can change about that. Although, to be honest, I'm not really sure how many of them can change. They're kind of facts of how the industry works. Maybe people find that useful, or this can be a starting point for conversations, with other people in the industry, publishers, and maybe people can be a bit more aware of kind of how things are working and how it can lead. I think it kind of inevitably leads to burnout, realistically, if you work in this industry for long enough, especially as a freelance game designer. The first I want to talk about is Workload. When you're a freelance game designer, you sign your game to a publisher, and then, you'll work together to develop that game, to get it ready for the market. You'll develop the rule book, there'll be some editing, there'll be development on the game itself. The publisher will organize illustrations, graphic design, this kind of thing. Then the game will be released, there'll be marketing around the game, and then it's available for sale, and hopefully it does well. I think more and more I'm aware of that the workload that's expected from the game designer in this whole process, and to be clear, the process I'm talking about is kind of post-contract. Of course, it's natural that before your game is signed, well, the game's all your work. Nobody else is going to do it for you. You're the game designer. But, once you sign that contract with a publisher, I'm seeing it more and more, or at least I've had more experiences, and it feels like I've had these experiences more and more lately, where there isn't a very good delineation between the work that's expected from the designer. There's not a very good definition of how much work the designer has to do post-contract with the publisher, and it varies massively. So I think the first thing why it kind of contributes to burnout is you just kind of don't know. Often it's very hard to plan a sort of measured working schedule, because in the worst case, publishers don't necessarily let you know with a lot of time that they need to get things done. I've definitely had multiple times in my career where a publisher kind of out of nowhere has emailed saying they're sending, the files off to the printer at the end of the week, and they need me to check everything. They need me to check all the files. They want me to check the rule book, etc., etc. And of course, I might have seen these things along the development process, but I might not have seen the latest version. I might not have been up to breast with all the changes. I might not have even seen the final laid out version. I might have just seen it as a text document, or I might have only seen my own prototype, but I haven't seen it actually, with illustrations and graphics. And then out of nowhere, I get an email which is suddenly, now please do all this work. I want to be clear, these emails don't come as a kind of a command. They don't come as a dictate. You are going to do this work or else. It's not that publishers are malicious, and often they're sending me these things because they want me to be able to see them, that they want me to be able to check them. But if I email back and say, I don't have time, sorry, that would be okay. They would just send them off anyway. But of course, then you're in a bit of a bind as a designer, because you know that there are plenty of times that things get released with, errors in the rules or errors on the components, and it's a mess. And so you're put in this somewhat impossible position of either having no boundaries in terms of your workload and just saying, okay, I got this email and now I'm going to look at, I'm going to do this huge amount of work, which I wasn't planning for. And maybe I already had other work that I had to do. So I'm going to, work even longer hours to do this thing to make sure that, we're releasing the best game possible. And, inside me, and I'm sure a lot of game designers, you want to do that. You want to release the best game, not just for, obviously like financial implications, because, the better you make the game, hopefully the better it will sell. But just from the case of like, this is a thing you've made, you want it to be the best thing. There's like an intrinsic drive, I think, when you create something, you want it to be the best it can be. And you feel like you want to put that effort in, but the choice is either don't do that and risk problems down the line, and that self-sense of sort of failure, or that you didn't put enough work into it. Why didn't you put that effort to check over things? Or you just take on a whole bunch of work out of nowhere, which can lead to burnout. And sometimes these things are not simple. I've had email threads about rulebook edits that have gone into the triple digits number of emails in the threads. Hundreds of emails back and forth with multiple individuals. Even when the publisher, hires a rulebook editor, which I think is fantastic, and it's a very important thing. I've made videos about, the specific skill sets. Editing is a very different skill set from developing or designing, and getting people who do that and are skilled in that, job is very important. But sometimes you're communicating the publisher, editor, designer, developer, everyone's chatting in an email thread, looking at files, seeing what's changed. Sometimes those changes are tracked well, sometimes you have to figure out every time you open the file. It's kind of brutal, and it feels a bit unending. And that kind of leads on to the other part of this kind of workload thing, is that I think this question about development, I think it's been an issue for a while that there's a very grey line between what is considered the designer's responsibility with regards to development. So with like once the game is signed to a publisher. And it's not very well defined. And it's really I think, mostly up to the publisher in terms of what they expect the designer to do, but that's not always very well communicated, or even if it is communicated, sometimes it doesn't work out that way in reality because things change or people leave the company who are going to do a particular job, and then again, it's like either the designer does it or it doesn't get done, and then the game isn't, as good as it can be. More and more, sometimes it feels like you sign a game with a publisher and they really somehow don't agree with some core part of the game when they signed it, and they sort of expect the designer, to me, or me and my co-designers, to kind of fix this problem, this really core problem in the game, which I would say is something like really, it's not just like one edge case that, kind of have to fix this unbalanced card or something. I'm talking about, there's something part of the core mechanism of the way the game works that they just don't agree with. Or one of the things that comes up all the time is interaction, where, a publisher feels like the game isn't interactive enough and wants to put more interaction into the game. They think that's sort of a normal thing to do in development. But because it's not well defined, and often these companies don't have a developer do all that work again falls on the designer. And I've had a few projects, especially this year, where we've delivered multiple revisions to a game trying to fix this problem, but also kind of communicating to the publisher, look, we know this game pretty well, or we think we know the game pretty well, we've worked on it for a very long time, and it can't be the thing you want it to be because it's just not this style of game. Like, this game can't be interactive, for instance, because that's not the style of game it is. Some games are just not interactive because of the way the mechanisms work or the way that players will interact with each other. And trying to, fit a square peg into a round hole, it just leads to a lot of work and no real result. And I think that really contributes to a huge amount of burnout. And I know it's not just my experience, talking to other designers who have been through these kind of, almost development hells. And the thing is, it's almost irrespective of how it turns out, because like the toll has already kind of been taken on you. Like in the best case, it kind of works out that you put a lot of development in the game and it results in a better game, and you're really happy with the work you did and you're glad that you did it. In the worst case, you don't make any progress at all and you waste a lot of time doing all these iterations that effectively go in the bin. And in some cases, the game doesn't, get made at all. But in either case, you're doing a whole bunch of extra work that you don't really know how to budget for, you're certainly not paid for. We get paid based on royalties when the game sells. It's not based on how much work we put in with the publisher. In Burnout, they talk a lot about a mismatch between sort of effort and reward, and I think this is a really clear case of where the industry expects a lot more effort from designers in that development stage than the rewards they actually get. Again, I should be clear, I don't think necessarily publishers are taking advantage of designers. I don't think it's a intentionally malicious process, but unfortunately it's kind of how the industry's set up. Publishers don't have people hired to do these jobs, so they kind of need someone to do it. Maybe you have to be a lot better at saying no to publishers when they ask these kind of things, but again, you're put in that tough spot of like, well, you could say no, but then do you not care about your game wanting to be the best it can be? So what can be really done about that? I'm not sure, if I'm honest. I would love, for instance, it to become really standard to pay designers for development work, say an hourly rate or some agreed upon sum of money, because I do think it's sometimes a bit hard to exactly quantify how long something will take. Of course, when the development is quite small and, you're not talking about changing a whole core system of the game, but again, you're changing 4 or 5 cards or something like that. I'm not saying that we have to be paid for every little bit of work, but I think at least starting from the expectation where the designer can kind of go to the publisher and say, look, this is more work than what I'm really prepared to do, and it be normalized enough to have that conversation, and the publisher go, okay, yeah, I understand. If I want you to do this work, then I kind of need to pay you for it. And even beyond that, I would really love to see more clarity in terms of the decisions that publishers make when they sign a game. I still think the best model is the option model, where a publisher, if they're interested in a game, will sign effectively an option contract with the designer, which gives them the right to pursue a game and try and make a decision about a game for a set period of time, somewhere between 3 to 6 months. And at the end of that period, then they have the option to offer a full contract to publish the game. But if they don't offer the contract, then the option contract finishes, the rights return to the designer, they can show it to anybody else. As part of that option contract, money is paid to the designer for the publisher to effectively reserve the game for that time. And I think this is really great for a few reasons. One is that effectively the designer is getting remunerated for the time that the game is kind of out of circulation, like it's not being shown to any other publisher. And if the publisher passes at the end of that time, well, then the designer's kind of out 3 to 6 months. You know, they're kind of back to square one. And at least that payment is sort of covering that time, you know, wasted in terms of the game's journey towards publication. And I think the other thing about that in terms of development is that often the companies that use option contracts, because they don't want to waste their money, they put the time in that option time to really work out, does the game fit with what they want to do? In the best case, actually, this doesn't involve the designer at all. The best publishers go off, play the game a lot. Maybe they even try some light development themselves. They might change a few things. At the end of it, they feel really confident that this is the game they want to do. And they don't need to make huge changes, and there's not going to be this huge development cycle on the game. And then they can confidently come back to the designer and say, look, yeah, we really like it. We know how it's going to fit in the market and what we're going to do with it. Here's a contract. Let's go. Instead of the current model where I see more and more publishers signing games, I think just too early. I think they either make sort of a snap judgment about a game, or they haven't considered all the possibilities, or they just haven't tested enough. I'm not on the side of those conversations, so I don't quite know what's going on. But I would really love to see the option contract model become far more normalized in the industry, actually. And also this covers the other problem on the other side, where sometimes publishers will ask you to develop a game before you sign it. So you'll submit a game to a publisher, they'll try it, and they'll say, oh, we're really interested, but if you could just change this bit or this bit, then, you know, that would fit better for us. And they give you that information, but that's not with a contract. And they say, yeah, we'd love to see it again if you work on these things. But they're just inviting you to kind of do development before the contract. And that's not a great model either. So I think the option contract kind of does the best to fix these pre-contract signing problems and post-contract signing problems as well. So I think that would be a really great thing to think about. And I think it would really help in terms of that workload that's expected from designers, and might really help with this kind of feeling of burnout. Another element to burnout is this idea of control, or the feeling that you don't have a lot of control in the decisions you get to make as part of your work, but also you don't have a lot of control in terms of the results of your work. You know, you can feel like you're putting a lot more effort into something than for the results you get. Unfortunately, if you're a full-time game designer, you live by sales. The ultimate reward for your work is royalties, and there's no way for you to predict that. And in the best case, it's amazing because as I've been able to be a full-time game designer for some number of years, you know, I'm making money from games that were released several years ago that I don't do any more work on. The positive side is the royalty model gives you extreme freedom, effectively. But on the other side, it can be really hard for your mental health when you have several games in a row, potentially, that you've worked a lot on in designing and developing, working with a publisher. You know, often each game you've been working multiple years on, they get released and they just don't do well. They kind of disappear without a trace in the market. And I think this is becoming more and more frequent as more and more games get released. That's not a new thing, but I do definitely feel that it's even less and less predictable now. I think before, or even, you know, when I started, say 10 or 15 years ago, you could see a big difference between, okay, this is a bigger company that, you know, has an advertising budget, or they have existing relationships with retailers and that sort of thing. And you could have a fair prediction of, if I sign with this bigger publisher, then yeah, I'll probably sell more copies because they have those existing relationships, they have the processes around marketing. And that's not a shame on smaller publishers, but they just don't have the resources to do that, or the experience or position in the market. But I don't think that's true anymore. There have been games that I've had released from quite big companies, or at least companies within big companies in the industry, that have just bombed. It might be that the games weren't really good. You know, I can take that, but that small feeling of control that you had, which is like kind of choosing the publisher and hoping that, you know, they would be able to devote more to marketing or position the market, you know, that's not really there anymore. And I think when they line up, when you have several in a row that have that feeling, it can take really a toll on your mental health, and, you know, really kind of lead to that feeling of burnout, because you're just working so hard and at the end of it, it just flops, and there's just nothing. And kind of even worse than the money, in a way, I'm really lucky to not have to depend on every release doing really well to be able to survive. I'm really lucky in that way. But even beyond the feeling of, it not doing financially well, it's just the feeling that just, like, nobody even knows it existed, Like, you put all this effort into creating something, and it just disappears. Sometimes even worse, when there are problems with the game or with the publisher, sometimes it can just be really negative experiences. When a game is released or it doesn't do well, or there are problems with it. And, it can be really hard to disconnect from that because you care. The relationship that designers have with publishers, designers are in the lower power part of that relationship. Publishers are ultimately, they're taking the financial risk and they get to make the final decisions about things. And even more than that, they kind of know what the plan is. They know, how they're going to manufacture the game. They know what illustrations they're going to go with. They know what theme they're going to go with. They know what media outlets they might try and get the game to. They, if they have a marketing plan. Often as designers, we don't actually even know any of these things. It's very rare that publishers will kind of share that information with you. So we don't really control how the game is presented to players or where it's presented to them. Sometimes we don't have much control about how a game looks. And of course, often players will have opinions about a lot of those things and might attribute them to the designer, when in reality we don't have any control over that. And that can be a really hard thing to process and kind of react to. All that effort you put into making games, and, like, is it even worth it? I had thought previously maybe that's just a reflection of a few bad experiences, but I'm realizing how much is sort of permeating a lot of how I just work and just how I'm feeling, generally on an everyday basis. So I'm not really sure what can be done about that exactly. I would just say to anybody out there, just remember that, there are designers behind the games that you're talking about, and that we're human beings, and any kindness or empathy is, really welcome. More than anything, I'd just like to see more conversations about these kind of issues, about mental health within the industry, especially within creatives within the industry, and how the industry is structured that might lead to those problems with mental health. And, we're only going to get to solutions if we start with talking about it. If nobody talks about it, then, we'll not even realize there's a problem, and you can't make any solutions if you don't even know there's a problem. This hopefully can just start conversations, and I'd love if anyone's watching this and it kind of either resonates, or if you have thoughts about it, please do leave them in the comments below. As always, try to be kind and gentle with each other. I'm really glad that it seems to be like a really positive community that's kind of built around this channel, and I'm really thankful for that. And, especially around things with mental health, I think that sort of kind and empathy-based discourse is even more important. Yeah, and as for myself, I'm still trying to figure it all out. So yeah, we'll see how it goes. But thank you very much for watching, as always, and for watching all my videos. And I will be back to more normal game design content soon. But as always, thanks very much for watching, and all the best with your game designing and playing. Bye.